Welcome to our online Sunday experience and our October teaching series, How to Do Less, Separating Worth from Production and the Rush of Being in No Hurry. It's a practical 4-week series about how to slow down in a world that never stops. The message you're about to hear was recorded live, and we hope that it will inspire you to join God in the renewal of all things.
So this morning we're going to try something a little bit new, and there's a reason behind it. As a pastoral team in this last season, as we prepared for this year, we thought, what would be a really great thing to do is to put some practical tools in people's hands during this season where everything seems so destabilized. So what we're trying to do with the messages in the next 3 months at the very least is I'm probably going to preach for 2/3 of the time that I usually preach. And then for the last third, Allison's going to give something to benefit what I just said. So here's the basic breakdown. I'm going to give an idea, something to think about, scriptures, we're going to unpack it. And then Allison's going to come on via video and give us a practical tool or a spiritual rhythm that we can use to apply the things that we've talked about and learned today, not only into this coming week, but in the weeks to come. So we're trying to put these things in place for you, recognizing that, hey, things are a little bit different now. And we're also recognizing that the majority of our worshiping community is unable to be with us here on Sundays. So the way we're formatting it is for those who are listening or watching from home. So with all of that in mind, today we bring in a brand new 4-week series entitled How to Do Less, Separating Worth from Production and the Rush of Being in No Hurry. And I know that title sounds a little bit counterintuitive, right? But that's kind of the point. None of us ever strive to do less, right? You don't wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to do nothing. No one ever thinks that way. The way we're programmed is, what more can I do? What else can I add? What else do I have to look after? How much more can I put on my plate? And there are reasons why we approach life that way. And we're going to explore them over the next 4 weeks or so. But we're going to take all those things we feel compelled to do, things we feel like we have to do in order to survive. We're going to take those things and we're going to look at them through the lens of Sabbath. Yes, Sabbath, God's rest. And if we had to make a working definition of Sabbath for us this morning in this series, it would go something like this. Sabbath is stopping. Sabbath is ceasing from that cycle of productivity. But Sabbath has also been called a cathedral in time, meaning it's a moment where we enjoy the good things that God has given us to enjoy. And when we enjoy those moments, when we rest, it actually is worship. Our rest becomes worship. And Sabbath is actually rest. Sabbath is a rest that is an alternative to the 24/7 nature of our world. Sabbath is a rest that is a resistance to the values and to the worries that drive our non-stop culture. Sabbath is a rest that calls out our restlessness and names our anxiety. And that's where we're headed today. Sabbath is the resistance to, or the alternative from, our anxiety. The anxiety that fools us to go nonstop all day, every day. So today specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens to us when we see one another merely as threats and competitors. We're going to talk a little bit about doom scrolling, and if you don't know what doom scrolling is, I'll get to it. We're going to talk about how that doom scrolling ties into our survival instincts. And finally, we're going to look at the words of Jesus as to why we are allowed, in fact, commanded to slow down and rest. And as I said before, directly following the message, Allison is going to be up via video to give us a practical tool, a spiritual practice that will help us apply what we've learned today into real life. So let's start here from Exodus chapter 20. And it goes like this. God spoke all these words, I am God, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of a life of slavery. Observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Work 6 days and do everything you need to do, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to God, your God. Don't do any work, not you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your servant, nor your maid, nor your animals, not even the foreign guests visiting your town. For in 6 days God made heaven, earth, and sea, and everything in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day. He set it apart as a holy day. Now, if you are familiar with the Ten Commandments, you may have noticed that this particular commandment about Sabbath is the one that gets the most airtime. And the reason for this is because it's related directly to the people and to the moment that it was first uttered. You might remember that the Ten Commandments sort of roll out. They are received shortly after Israel escapes from Egypt. And you have to understand, these are people that have been born and raised. All they know is Egypt, and they're formed under Egyptian rule. So what we get with the Ten Commandments as a whole is actually a reset. It's a new way to be in the world, a way that is an alternative, a resistance to the way these people have been brought up, a resistance to the way they thought the world worked. So for God to open this passage here in the Ten Commandments with the line, God spoke these words, I am God, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of a life of slavery, this is God sort of sneaking in there and saying, hey, things are going to change here. This is a tip-off that what I'm about to say is about to change everything. Because those who heard these words for the very first time could well remember what life had been like under the rule of Pharaoh in Egypt. They would have remembered that Pharaoh thought he was of God. They would have remembered Egypt's socioeconomic power is sort of built like a pyramid, where there's a bunch of people working really hard at the bottom to support all the people, or the few people actually, up top. They would have remembered that even though Pharaoh was at the top, that guy was so anxious, that guy was so restless, that anxiety and worry trickled down to everything and everyone below him. And they would have remembered how that anxious state that Pharaoh was in caused him to do some really weird things in a governmental way, where the crown would usurp money and cattle and land and ultimately people, peasants, those whose bodies were taken and made into slaves. And these people who had just escaped Egypt would have remembered all the anxiety around food production that led to these unattainable work quotas that never ended. And so the Ten Commandments start with this line that basically says, I remember where you came from. I remember how you were formed. But let me tell you, the true God is offering you a better way to be, because life doesn't have to be this way. And so the Ten Commandments, including this long-winded one about the Sabbath, are like a rewiring of people's brains. Or better yet, it's probably more like a hard reset. It's a return to the beginning, to the way we were actually designed to be and live. And so, the commandments that actually follow this one about the Sabbath actually get right down to the very basics of the human operating system. You might be familiar with them. Honor your father and mother so that you'll live a long time in the land of God your God is giving you. No murder, no adultery, no stealing, no lies about your neighbor, no lusting after your neighbor's house or wife or servant or maid or ox or donkey. Don't set your heart on anything that is your neighbor's. Now, you and I read this and we're like, yeah, so what? Get it? Heard it? Yeah, been there, done that. But for the people of Israel, this is the first time they had ever heard anything like this. Specifically, how to be a good neighbor, how to look after one another, how to get along with one another. Because in Pharaoh's system, there were no neighbors. No, in Pharaoh's system, there were only threats and competitors. And that anxiety drove everything. And so, those who participate in Sabbath break the anxiety cycle. They are invited to an awareness that life does not consist in frantic production and consumption that reduces everyone else to threat and competitor. And as the work stoppage permits a waning of anxiety, so energy is redeployed to the neighborhood. The odd insistence of God is to counter anxious productivity with committed neighborliness. The latter practice does not produce so much, but it creates an environment of security and respect and dignity that redefines the human project. So then, to all of those people who are trapped in this system of threats and competitors, those people, the scriptures are saying, are bound to dishonor their mom and dad or unproductive kin. And so God says, honor your mom and dad, even if they don't deserve it. Those who are trapped in this system of threats and competitors are bound to violence, bound to kill. So God says, do not kill. For those people who are trapped in the system of threats and competitors, they're bound to this sexual interaction, making sex a commodity, meaning I'm just going to take from you what I want for my own pleasure. And so God says, don't sleep with the people that you shouldn't be sleeping with. Those who are trapped in this system of threats and competitors are bound to take from others whatever they want. And so God says, do not steal. Those who are trapped in the system of threats and competitors are bound to say whatever they want to get whatever they want. And so God says, do not lie. Those who are trapped in the system of threats and competitors are bound to chase after more and more and more and more. And so God says, don't covet. Don't chase after what others have. God says, you don't need to be that way anymore. You don't need to operate that way anymore because I am offering you an alternative way of being. And so the Sabbath, God's rest, is a resistance to the anxiety that drives you and me to see others merely as threats or competitors. Sabbath is an act of a resistance to that feeling you and I have inside that makes us want to do more and more and more and more and more. So resting in God's rest is an alternative to all of the worry that you carry. Unfortunately, not worrying and not being anxious, those are really hard habits to break, especially since our survival instincts actually draw us away from rest and towards actual trouble. Check this out. Super interesting. It might be counterintuitive that we are hooked by bad news. Ned Personnel, a licensed clinical social worker and director of Plan Your Recovery and Addiction Treatment Center, writes via email. But the human brain has evolved to address stimuli hierarchically, to deal first with those things that have the highest degree of survival salience. Sun Junan, director of Games and Virtual Environments Lab at the University of Georgia, where her research focuses on how virtual experiences affect behavior in the physical world, says people probably aren't searching for disheartening news, as the term doom scrolling implies. They're simply info gathering. Seeking out information is something we tend to do even during normal circumstances in order to make informed decisions, she says. Unfortunately, a lot of information is negative these days, and we're motivated to pay more attention to negative news and remember it longer because it has a direct linkage to our survival. Additionally, according to Presnall, content is increasingly designed to trigger hyperarousal by playing on our more primitive emotions, fear and outrage, which activates the survival centers of our brain. So On explains, we continue looking for answers by clicking on recommended content rather than searching separately for every piece of information. And in doing so, we reinforce the artificial intelligence or algorithm behind the platform to think that this is the type of news we want, unintentionally attracting more of the same. Now, have you ever caught yourself doom scrolling? You know what doom scrolling is? You got your phone in your hand or your tablet, and your thumb is just going up, just up, 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 right? It could be Twitter, it could be news, it could be Facebook, it could be whatever. You're just endlessly scrolling upwards on your phone. And that's ever happened to you, it's because the platform has been designed to do that very thing to you. To get you hooked on, well, what happened now? What happened yesterday? What's the latest calamity? Trump said what? And we just keep going and going and going. And if you've ever felt anxious or exasperated or depressed by what's happening to our world, this kind of stuff is sort of starting to play inside of you. So, has doom scrolling or searching for news or being on the internet, has that ever left you worried? Has that ever left you worried about your survival? Like the chaos that's happening somewhere else, is it going to happen to you? Does it make you worried for your kids and for your loved ones? Are you worried about what else you have to do to keep safe and to keep life balanced and to keep life in order? If so, to your anxiety, to your survival instincts, and to your worry, Jesus says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about your clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Now, confession. I am hooked on doom scrolling. Absolutely. And my phone sends me a report once a week as proof as how I spent my time doom scrolling the last 7 days. And sometimes when I find myself very low, the report or the proof that I'm actually looking for is if God actually still cares about me, or if God is actually still paying attention to this world and what's going on. And so to that feeling, if you've had it like me, Jesus says, oh, you need proof? Oh, is it proof that you want? Cool. Do you need assurance that God has you covered so that you don't have to worry about your survival? If that's the case, Jesus says, look at the birds and look at the flowers. The birds and the flowers are your proof. Look at them, Jesus says, and remind yourself. Because, my friends, every single time creation does its thing, it is a reminder that God is still present, that God is still active, and that God is still for you. Every time we lift our eyes from our devices and look out the window, it's a reminder that God has your life under his care. So then, to rest in God's care is again an act of resistance, an alternative to the broken ways that humanity has organized itself. A breaking of that cycle of worry that says, oh, you better look after yourself. You'd better make yourself survive through this. And so to all of that, Jesus invites his disciples, both then and now, out of the anxiety system by saying, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So weariness, being heavy laden, or a yoke, those are different ways of talking about a commodity-based society that requires endless productivity. In this particular context here, Jesus might be specifically talking about the heavy Roman taxation system, because that word yoke is often used in terms of referring to imperial imposition. Or Jesus could be talking about the endless requirements of an overcoated religious system of that day that required those who were involved to be on every day, 24/7. So to all of that, and to those who feel all of that, Jesus says, come out. Come on out. I'm inviting you to something better. To all of you who find yourselves trapped in worry, come to Jesus. For all of you who find yourself trapped by the endless productivity that demand on your life to do more, Jesus says, come to me. To all of you who feel trapped by an endless restlessness, in a worry that dominates your every single day, Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you the rest that you need. So then, according to Jesus, the alternative to anxiety is actually trust. A trust that God's got you. A trust that you are no longer owned or defined or committed to the system of productiveness or the anxiety that it produces. A trust that invites you to something better. Sabbath is an act of resistance where we become non-participants in the anxiety that drives our world. And what that means for you and I is this. You don't need to be anxious, because Jesus invites you out of that way of living and into his Sabbath rest. So with all of that in mind, turn your attention to the screen as Allison gives us a practical tool as to put some of these things into play this coming week. Check it out.
Hi, Lakeview. Each Sunday for the following months, we're going to follow up Joe's sermons with an invitation to practice what we've heard preached. Now, while we planned to do this before COVID hit, it feels like it's been a move of the Spirit, because right now we are all in desperate need of practices that will help us live well in this chaotic moment and sustain us over the long haul. For those of you who are new to this, practices are habits that help shape those who follow Jesus into a countercultural community. A community that witnesses to the fact that God is at work making things right and doing so by grace, no matter the circumstances we find ourselves in. These practices also help form and transform us into the kind of people who can meet life in all its difficulties with grace and strength. They are practices that carry us through joy-filled and hard times, as well as front-load responses for when life gets tough. These practices are things like prayer, reading our Bible, being generous, living simply, and Sabbath. Practices remind us that while it matters what we believe doesn't actually form us or change us. What we do, where we place our bodies, how we set up our lives to receive grace, is actually what forms us. For example, I absolutely believe that regular exercise is important for my physical, mental, and emotional health. but my belief that exercise is important doesn't actually do anything for me if I don't walk or run or lift weights. So, the practices are ways that we embody our faith. But even more importantly, they are ways that we place ourselves in the flow of God's grace so that we are formed by love instead of by other things. The practices do not earn us God's grace and love, but they open us up to the ways that God is continually offering grace and love, even when life is difficult. So, you're going to hear a lot of options over the next few months about how to practice faith or how to place yourself in the flow of God's grace. You can't do them all. We do not intend this to be a to-do list. Instead, consider these next few months an invitation to try things that compel you and then see if they bring you life. If they do, wonderful. If they don't, that's okay. Try a different practice and then commit to it and see what happens over time. The practices are meant to set a rhythm of life that brings lightness and joy. Okay, Sabbath. Sabbath, in its simplest definition, means to cease from engaging in the cycle of productivity for one day. It is space in time that is set aside to rest, and by resting, to resist the compulsion to reduce the value of creation and ourselves to only our usefulness. Sabbath is something we should all be practicing. It's not optional if we follow Jesus. In fact, it's the only practice that is included in the Ten Commandments. So it means that God takes it seriously, mostly because God really cares about the welfare of his creatures and his creation. Now, while it's something we should all be practicing, each of us will practice it differently because what it means to cease from production and our stage of life is different for each of us. I also want to encourage you that we have our whole life also to learn how to practice Sabbath. So start with where you're at. Some of us have Sabbath in our bones. We practiced it growing up and we still feel it in the same way we did when we were kids. For others of you, this is a new concept and you haven't tried it before. That's okay. I'm going to give you small, doable, flexible suggestions each week to help you start building Sabbath rest into your life. Our hope is that by the end of this series on Sabbath, not that you feel guilty or like you have to practice Sabbath, but that you would be inspired to try it, that it would sound like a great idea, and that it would be compelling. Because the goal of Sabbath is that it would be a day of rest and delight. And there are ways we can set up our Sabbath practice to help it be that way. Sabbath should be a day you look forward to, not a day you dread. So, your first invitation for practicing Sabbath: cease from anxiety. One way we can set up Sabbath to be a day we look forward to is to eliminate activities that cause anxiety in us, in our families, and in our communities on that day. Sabbath is intentionally stepping out of the system that runs on anxiety to experience the reality that the world continues to spin, not because someone is at the core running the gears, but because a God of love and rest is the one at the heart of it. And practicing Sabbath is a way that we live out or embody the belief that we serve a God who is trustworthy, who does not value people on the basis of their productivity, and whose love is unfazed by anything we do or do not do. Creation does not depend on our endless work, and neither does God. We do not need to be anxious. Now, we might know that in our heads, but anxiety can continue to live in our bodies. We all know that feeling. We can tell ourselves that there's no reason to be anxious, but sometimes our bodies tell us differently. Our hearts race, our tummies churn, we can't sit still. It can feel like there's this unnamed force in us that keeps us dissatisfied and fidgety. So how do we teach our bodies the truth that God is trustworthy. They do not need to be anxious. We practice Sabbath. We practice ceasing. We use not just our minds to understand the concept of Sabbath, we include our bodies in the belief that we do not need to be anxious by making space and time to rest. We tap out of the rat race and we use our bodies to do things that are not anxiety inducing. So that is your invitation for practice this week. If you have a practice of Sabbath already, a day where you cease, think about what you do on that day. Are any of your activities anxiety producing? That's probably an indication that you need to cease from them on that day. Maybe move them to a different day. If you don't have a day set aside where you practice Sabbath, start planning for it. Now, a whole day might be a tall order if this is new to you. So maybe you start by setting aside a morning or a couple of hours to practice Sabbath. And then you build on that. Let's imagine what that might look like. Maybe you've been practicing Sabbath for a long time, but you're still responsible for some things that cause anxiety, like maybe feeding your family. Maybe what you need to do is simplify. Perhaps you need to cease from the anxiety of getting all healthy food in your kids. Maybe you have something like pancakes or nachos for dinner, something your kids love that no one is going to argue about and that is really easy to prepare. If you make it a weekly tradition, it might even be something that everybody looks forward to. And if it's not too anxiety inducing, include your kids and your partner in helping you. I know for me, one of the things that I find anxiety inducing is that my kids don't clean the kitchen the way I would clean it. But maybe one day of the week, kid level clean is good enough. Or if grocery shopping or cleaning the house or yard work produce anxiety in you, it's not a Sabbath activity. We have to think these things through. For instance, sometimes putzing in the garden is super relaxing. By all means, then, do it on your Sabbath. But I would argue that shopping on Sabbath might be something to consider moving to another day, even if you don't find it stressful, simply because it's a way of engaging the cycle of production. Shopping isn't bad, we have to do it, but it's probably just not something that we need to do on our Sabbath day. If getting your 5K run or 10,000 steps is anxiety producing, tap out. Maybe just put the Fitbit or the Apple Watch on the counter and go for a hike with your family or just meander instead. I would suggest you refrain from checking your email, scrolling through the news, or social media. Avoid the doom scroll. Free yourself from the heavy weight of COVID news and pictures of people who haven't gained 10 pounds eating chips over isolation. Scrolling is not restful. It is anxiety inducing. In fact, it might be a good idea to cease from screen time on Sabbath altogether, unless it's intentional, like watching a movie with your family. And again, this might be a tall order for those of us who are connected to our phones like another appendage. So maybe you start with an hour or a mealtime and then a morning, and then you just build on it. Last suggestion. If kids' activities produce anxiety in your kids or in you, don't do them on Sabbath. Don't use your Sabbath to run to hockey or gymnastics if it means everyone in the house is in a terrible mood. And this one is for me, don't use Sabbath to nag your kids to do chores. Sabbath is a great way to teach your kids that they don't have to be the best or brightest or do all the things. They are loved no matter what. Teach them what it means to really rest. And that will require that you yourself learn what it means to really rest too. So we're going to build on this over the next 4 weeks. So stay tuned. I'll have some more suggestions for you next week. Sabbath is one of those practices that has deep meaning and rhythm that can change in the different stages of our life. So there's no pressure to get it all right by November. But let's start, no matter where we're at, and see what happens.